Welcome to another lesson on Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, also known as MDT. In this tutorial, I will cover the basics of the CustomSettings.ini and Bootstrap.ini files. I assume you are watching this video after you have already set up your MDT. If you need guidance on setting up MDT, please watch my previous tutorials on the setup process using the Windows Server 2022. Let's get started. On your Windows Server, open the Start menu and expand the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. And in here, we will launch the Deployment Workbench console. On your Deployment Workbench console, on the left-hand side, you should have MDT Deployment Share already added if you have followed my previous tutorial. In my previous tutorial, I went over the setup process and how you can configure some basic options within here. Today, what we are interested in is the two files, which is CustomSettings.ini and the Bootstrap.ini files. They are located in the settings or properties options under the MDT deployment shares. To get there, what you need to do is you have to select that MDT share, right click, go to properties, and in here we will select the tab called rules. Notice that under the rules, what you have viewing right now, what you see on your screen is basically the CustomSettings.ini file. If you click on Edit Bootstrap.ini right here, this button down here, it'll open up the Bootstrap.ini file with the settings associated with that. Please note that your MDT deployment share has a location in which the deployment share is being created. In my situation, it is under drive E/deployment share. Depending on your configuration, it may be on a different server or different location, C drive, E drive, etc., etc. Before we move forward, I'm going to show you what these files are and where they are located in our deployment share. So for me, it's E drive. So I'm going to open my file explorer. And in here, I'm going to go to this PC, E drive, and I see the deployment share folder right here. So I'm going to open that. Now I'm inside the deployment share folder and I need to locate the CustomSettings.ini and the Bootstrap.ini files. Those are located under the control folder. So if we go and open the control folder, you will see the CustomSettings.ini and the Bootstrap.ini. If you right click, and if you go to properties of any of these files, you can see it is a .ini file and it tells you what type of, the file name up here. And it's a very small file. You can actually open and edit those files here as well by simply right clicking here and go to open with and selecting notepad, and see the Bootstrap.ini file have the same information here as indicated on the properties section under edit Bootstrap.ini file. So basically this is where the file is located. So the Bootstrap.ini file and the CustomSettings.ini file, which is this part, is located inside your MDT deployment share folder under the control folder. Like if I open this CustomSettings.ini file with the notepad, you can see whatever you see here is exactly the same thing you see in the properties section, rules section in here. See, this is the same as what we see in here. It's exactly the same thing. So basically, your CustomSettings.ini file and Bootstrap.ini files are located within the deployment share folder. Now, the CustomSettings.ini file is a rules file processed by something called the ZTI gather.wsf after the Bootstrap.ini file is processed. And I will go into how you can also edit the UserID gather.wsf file later sometimes. But for now, just know that it is a file. The CustomSettings.ini file is a file that is being processed during the MDT configuration. The CustomSettings.ini file contains instruction to perform specific actions and set various parameters in MDT. You can get very creative when it comes to customizing the CustomSettings.ini file. In other words, you can get very creative with these options you see on the screen right here. But that is beyond the scope of this particular tutorial, so I'm not going to go into extremely complicated custom settings. What I want to focus today is I want you to give you an explanation of what is CustomSettings.ini and some basic configurations that you can do to customize your MDT deployment. So at the moment, when you look at my files right here, if you look at the rules tab under the properties of my the deployment share, you see there is already some information added here. If I go to my Bootstrap.ini file, you also see some settings added here. And you may be wondering, where are these settings coming from? Well, remember on my previous tutorial, during the new deployment share setup or new deployment share wizard, I selected certain options under the options part of that settings. If you don't remember that video, you can go back to my YouTube channel and watch that. So basically what happened is when I created the new deployment share, I selected these options. Again, like if you don't want to watch my previous video, I can quickly show you that as well. Basically, I can close this window. I can create a new deployment share. If I go in next, and let's say I put a second path, go next. This option right here, you see, I selected certain options in here, ask for a product key or don't ask for a product key. All of these settings that I selected here is what actually showing up under the rules section here. So whatever I have selected previously in that configuration wizard is where you see these things are coming up. And if you want to know why these are the way it is, you can go ahead and watch my previous video. So in other words, that Microsoft already help us with some of the rules that we're going to set in the CustomSettings.ini and the Bootstrap.ini through that wizard that we went through. Right now, on your screen, you see two sections in the CustomSettings.ini file, which is settings section and the default sections. These are the two default sections that comes with the MDT deployment share creation when you go through that configuration options. So in the settings section, we have the priority and the properties, and the default sections, we have a bunch of options added right below it. Now the priority property is basically a reserve property used for determining the order in which within the CustomSettings.ini will process items. In other words, you could think of it as a listings of declared function in which you can pull certain configurations options in that particular order. For example, what this is telling us right now is whenever this MDT is launched or run, it needs to process whatever it says default first before it launching anything else. So whatever in this default section going to be processed first, and then it's going to start processing everything else. The priority setting is hard to understand without some other groups or sections down here. So I'm going to copy and paste some configurations options I have created using a text file outside here. So you can actually do that. You can either type it in here, or you can create all your settings on a separate file and paste it up here. These are basically text files, right? So now if you look at the priority settings, I have the MAC address settings up here, and then I have the default section. In other words, the MAC address sections or groups will be processed first, then the default groups or sections will be processed next. So these are the MAC address sections or groups. So it's going to get processed first, and then it's going to process the default sections up here. These are custom settings, so you can type whatever you want as long as you adhere to the configuration options guidelines. So you can just enter whatever you want. You need to make sure you adhere to the particular configuration sections. For example, notice this section is not called MAC address. This section is not called MAC address. It actually has a MAC address in the section itself. The reason for that is when CustomSettings.ini file is processed, it can pull up default special sections that are built into MDT that doesn't need to be called, for example, MAC address. For example, I don't need this section to be labeled like this in order for this to be processed. The reason for that is this section is already understood or built into the MDT configurations options by Microsoft. So you don't need to have a MAC address section or group. You can simply enter your MAC address, whatever the MAC addresses you want to, and then give the priority up here. One of the disadvantage of that is basically when the MAC address section is run, it's going to run this thing first and then going to run next this one. So if you want to have a specific order, you better create the order as such. So in this priority example, I have created the MAC address section and the default section is there as it is from our configuration wizard I went through when we created the deployment share up here. But you don't see this new group that I created or new section I created called Sanuja group. So what happened to it? If you don't add your group or sections to the priority list up here, it will be completely ignored and it will not run when you launch the MDT on your client machine. So basically, if this MDT to run on a client machine, this section will be completely ignored. If you want to include this section, you need to make sure that is part of the priority list. So if I put this Sanuja group here in right here at the very first, what happens is it's going to run the Sanuja group, whatever included in here first, then it's going to run the MAC address, then it's going to run default. If I want this to be run second, I can put it into the right here, the comma. So it's going to run this one first, MAC address sections first, and it's going to run the Sanuja group next, and it's going to run default next. So the priority list defined which section or groups will be run or which section or groups will be ignored. So if I want to run this Sanuja group at the very last, I can add that to the very last section here, and the priority group will run MAC address section first or group first, the default group or section next, and the Sanuja group next. If I want to ignore that completely, you can simply remove that from the priority list. So in other words, the priority process the sections in order which appear up here. If you want to change the order, you simply change where this order goes, and that will change everything. So for example, I can actually cut this default section and I can put it way at the top right here. But that doesn't mean that this default section gonna run first, because I have specified on the priority section up here, the settings section up here, that the MAC address section should run first, then the default should run next. So doesn't matter the order in which you have typed out your groups or sections, you can reconfigure how it's actually going to run during deployment at the priority section. So as I mentioned, there are a couple of things that are basically default as configuration options available, such as the MAC address and bunch of other stuff. So that include like deploy route, resources, etc. I'm not going to go into those in detail in this particular video, just to keep this tutorial as short as possible. But I hope that you have a very good idea now that how the priority works and how you can create groups or sections within your CustomSettings.ini file. Once you understand that fundamental concept or basic concept, everything else gonna fall into place. It's very easy to follow through afterward because this is the same process for anything else you're gonna be adding here. The reason why I also included the Bootstrap.ini file in this tutorial is because it follows the same principles or rules. So if you are new to MDT, if you go into the properties of your share and go to the rules and click on edit Bootstrap.ini file right here, you will see the options that is included here that came from our configuration wizard that we ran on our previous tutorial. And you see the similar options, actually the same options. You see the settings section, it has the priority setup here, and it has the default section. It has the deploy route information down here. The Bootstrap.ini file and the CustomSettings.ini files are following the same rule set and use the same type of rules in terms of configurations, but they do slightly two different things. The Bootstrap.ini file get launched before the CustomSettings.ini file. It get launched before even the user sees anything on their screen, actually. Pretty much just at the moment they see stuff showing up on their screen. So what that basically means is whatever the configuration options contained within Bootstrap.ini file basically gonna get launched prior to the CustomSettings.ini files, and the CustomSettings.ini files take over from that point. In other words, if you change anything in CustomSettings.ini file right here, you don't need to recreate your the WinPE images. You don't have to redeploy any of these things. But if you change anything on Bootstrap.ini file, even though it can do the similar thing, you have to make sure you create your deployment files again, because this is gonna change the deployment file itself, and this is gonna get launched at the very beginning. In other words, the Bootstrap.ini file is very similar to CustomSettings.ini file in terms of format and structure and processing logic. However, the major difference here is that the Bootstrap.ini file is processed first when you boot into WinPE environment before anything else get launched, before the CustomSettings.ini file being processed. Even before the welcome screen is being shown to your users on the WinPE environment, it will be already running the Bootstrap.ini file. And just like CustomSettings.ini file, it is located in the same location as here, because I already showed you, it's right here, the Bootstrap.ini file. And currently it has two options, the settings section and the default section. This is going to be the most common two options that you have. And according to Microsoft, that there are a handful of properties that you can configure on Bootstrap.ini file, and I will list them on my website as well. That will allow you to do the similar configuration as the CustomSettings.ini files, but some of them are very unique settings that must be included in Bootstrap, cannot be included in CustomSettings.ini file. An example of this would be if you want to add a default administrative password and username. So when the MDT WinPE environment is launched, the user doesn't get the prompt for it, you need to add that in Bootstrap.ini file. So for example, I can use UserID equal to administrator, and you can do password. It should be user password. So my fake pass 1999 Canada or whatever you want to put in here. So you put your password, you put your server or a MDT administrator user account and the user password. And then what this is going to do is it will force your WinPE environment to launch without asking the end user the administrator username and password. You can even enter user domain. For example, you can put a domain. So it's sanuja.local. So what that's going to do is basically it's going to launch these options. They're going to configure these options before even launching the WinPE environment. So there are a lot of things like that you can do in here, like you can skip certain options. For example, you can completely skip the welcome screen. So you can do that with skip BD welcome, and you can put yes. What that's going to do is basically it's gonna skip the this should be BDD welcome. So it's gonna completely skip the welcome screen that you get. You know, the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit welcome screen can be skipped. So all of those kind of things can be configured in the Bootstrap.ini file. Again, this file get launched prior to the CustomSettings.ini file, and therefore this type of configuration has to be done on the Bootstrap.ini file, not in the CustomSettings.ini files. So if you change anything in Bootstrap.ini file, which I'm not going to do right now, you need to make sure that once you have done that, you run rerun your deployment shares. Again, if you change anything in the settings, the CustomSettings.ini file, you don't need to change, you don't need to rerun the deployment share. But if you change anything on the Bootstrap.ini file, you have to change you need to rerun your deployment share. In other words, if you change anything in the Bootstrap.ini file, unlike the CustomSettings.ini file, you have to select your MDT deployment share, right click, and you need to run update deployment share. If you change anything in the CustomSettings.ini file, you don't need to do that. But if you do any changes inside the Bootstrap.ini file, you must right click and then update the deployment share right here. If you don't update it, you will not get those changes that you make to Bootstrap.ini file right here. That's everything for this tutorial today. I just want to give you a broad overview of how .ini files work with the MDT deployment shares. I hope this will be helpful to people who are new to using Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. If you have any questions or concerns regarding anything I covered today, please reach out to me. If you like these type of tutorials, please make sure to thumbs up this video and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget that I have already posted a couple of tutorials on MDT as well as numerous tutorials on Microsoft Windows Server configurations on my YouTube channel. So you can go ahead and check them out. And until next time, thank you so much and have a nice day.